Well, recording is in progress, and thanks so much for
Yes.
joining us. Hi there, Marc Gauvin.
Thank you for having me again. And this is a good opportunity to at least document the things we're talking about, which I think are, today we're going to get into the nitty gritty, you know.
Yes.
In other words, one of the critiques that I get with regards to what we're saying is that it's all so technical, and we're speaking from not where people are, but we're speaking from some kind of more exclusive level of knowledge of engineering and things like that. Hello, yeah. And and that we need to get, and then the question is that that's great that we're right, but what are the probabilities of people actually listening and taking this up, right? And this has been a problem for me, because when we start with these types of things that are have such potential impact, right? That you sort of wonder why make such an effort if people aren't going to pick it up, and you're not going to get a large following and all that stuff. It seems like that's sort of a measure of your success. And sticking to our guns of project management and stuff like that, what we realize is one thing that a lot of people don't grasp, especially in our media-dominated view of social problems and politics, and that is the nature of a requirement. So a requirement is not optional.
Right.
So the logic of the problem dictates it. It doesn't something that you choose. You say, well, I don't like that requirement. Let's find one that I think is more likely to happen, right? It's either if something is a requirement, you have to live with it. And the best example I come up with is that if you're in the desert, no matter how improbable it is to find water, that's your number one requirement. And that doesn't change, right?
Correct.
So that is what gives us the courage to continue and to persist in this. But then on the other hand, there is a communications issue, and I don't like to get people to agree or understand something under some kind of with any kind of coercion, right? I like people to arrive at their own conclusions. But today's talk is going to be a bit by why should we care about money's misrepresentation? Why is it a priority for us right now? And what responsibility do we all have? And what are the consequences of not living up to our responsibility? And I'm not just thinking about personal moral musings, but I'm thinking about also from a formal treatment of the question of responsibility, which is embedded in at least, I think, Anglo-Saxon, North American for sure, law, which has to do, which we can unearth when we think about how the legal, what's the legal treatment for misrepresentation, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. I have, if we need it, we can refer to a little blah, blah, blah I wrote recently on Facebook that got some, a bit of a reaction from people. But this is going to put things in perspective. So if I were to ask you,
yes,
Andrew,
yes.
And I would say, Andrew, if you didn't know that some notion that you had that you were using in your life was somehow invalid or wrong, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you just said taking it up by rote because that's the way we brought up, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Would you feel responsible if suddenly I said, well, you're using that notion, and that notion really constitutes a misrepresentation?
Well, actually, I was actually faced with that just after high school because honestly, I was offered an opportunity to attend a four-year college in Georgia. It happened to be a historically Black college university named Fort Valley, which may or may not be relevant. But I was at the top of my class for my SAT scores. Back then, it was like, I think 1040 or something like that. Nothing really earth-shattering now, but back then, it was the highest SAT score that had been achieved at this particular high school for African Americans, right? And so I was expecting and looking for scholarship offers from some of the top schools in Georgia, but no, didn't happen. But the school that did invite me, I had a chance to visit their library, and unfortunately, Mark, their material was several years out of date, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I could find more relevant material at my local university, Catholic University, just by walking in. So I decided I needed to kind of shift my way of thinking, and I took a course, a correspondence course, was very popular back then, from a company called Federated Tax Service. And that gave me my first opportunity to understand the difference between cash and accrual accounting. And until that point, Mark, my mind had always thought, well, cash, as long as I have cash, right? Then this is what I have to work with. It was that reawakening that shifted my entire perspective. So I am aware of changes that can be made when you're presented with new information. So that's a short answer, or the long answer.
Okay, but I wasn't asking about that. I was asking about not just what you're saying is that new information a change of perspective. But the question is if you felt suddenly that somebody was accusing you of misrepresentation.
Oh, well,
but you genuinely didn't understand that you were committing a misrepresentation, would you feel guilty?
Well, in the first
place,
responsible. Well, okay, an immediate response on my part was like, ignorance of the law is no excuse, right? But on the other hand, if I don't know, Mark. So how can I know what?
Right.
Yeah, but now once I find out, then it is in fact my responsibility to make a change, do something about it, bring it to. So yes, and that's a human responsibility.
Excellent.
Human responsibility.
So the law, as it's written, takes that into account.
Okay.
In other words, there are 3 levels of responsibility or liability for misrepresentation.
Okay.
And this is something people have to understand. There's innocent misrepresentation. I just didn't know, right?
Right.
And anybody would be hard pressed to punish someone for not knowing what they don't know. I don't think that anybody can be required to know what they don't know. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to require someone to know what they don't know. Then there is negligent misrepresentation. That means you honestly didn't know, but damn, that was your responsibility. I mean, you're the expert in the field, and you should know these things, right? And you didn't. If you were negligent, and you should have known, but you didn't bother to look the word up, or you didn't bother, right? Then that's negligent. That's a little more severe.
Well, Mark, but you have to take a step backwards and consider the ethics of the situation, right? Now, for example, for the last 34 years, I've been doing work as a legal secretary, basically, for an attorney. Here in California, you can actually get your license to do that, right? But if you are, let's say, after 1998, unless you had already acquired your experience, then you'd have to go to school for that, right? However, the first course is always ethics. And so when you're talking about negligence in the professional sphere, right, has to be based upon knowledge of what it is that you're doing in the first place and having an understanding of what it is you're doing, and then a commitment from a professional standpoint of doing those things before you can be accused of negligently not doing something. Or
sure. I'm
yes.
not denying that, but what I am saying is that the law contemplates 3 levels.
Okay.
The first level is innocent.
Okay.
The second level is negligent, and that's to be determined by the merits of the case. To say, well, he should have known. We conclude that he should have known what the what the stresses were on the material of the building he built that collapsed, right? So,
Okay.
so
Yeah. Right.
and so he was negligent. He didn't do his homework, right?
Okay. Got it. Yeah.
And then there's a third level, which I had trouble with because it's very hard to distinguish these things precisely because in every case, and especially with something as surprising as money's misrepresentation, which is really part of our culture.
Okay.
But so it's very hard for us to know or to assume that something that's so fundamental to our existence would be wrong. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of leeway there for saying didn't know, right? But fraudulent is interesting because I was looking to try and see, how that's, I can understand this fraudulent, which is the first one is I knew perfectly well it was wrong, but I couldn't give a damn, right? But there's another, that wasn't what I found. What I found was the following sentence or statement: reckless disregard.
Okay.
So that means you might not know, right? But you manifest that you couldn't give a damn.
Right.
Right. Okay. So that goes into fraud, right? So, so in other words, it's obvious that if you knew and you didn't pay attention, then that's a reckless disregard. So yeah, but the thing is, you can have reckless disregard for something you don't know, and this is what I'm trying to get at today, right? So you said something that to me is really important to this conversation at the beginning, and that was that you don't know, and no one can blame you for not knowing. But once you know, then you're no longer innocent, right?
Well, that applies to me as an individual, but I have difficulty in seeing how that would apply to either an organization or in particular a government, which has as its responsibility, quote unquote, the continuity of the state, regardless of the consequences to its own members or to the rest of the world. That gets a bit more complicated, Mark.
No, I'm sure, but let's talk about our personal responsibility first.
Okay.
And under no circumstances can we assume that our allegiance to some organization or some mandate would in any way excuse us to act in a way that isn't consequential. So I think that we can talk about organizations or entities or companies being persons, and that's a whole other topic. Right. But I think that the real issue we're talking about is our personal responsibility. So the thing is, insofar as that we, in one way or another, partake in some misrepresentation, be it by rote, and we didn't know, whatever. But the moment someone alerts us, now here's the question: somebody might alert something to an argument that proves or claims to prove that a misrepresentation is taking place.
Okay. Right? Yes.
And or that one is actually participating in a misrepresentation, and you can say, well, I'm going to have to study that, make sure. I'm sure you're right. But what you can't do, because that would put you immediately into the fraudulent level, and this happens every day in my personal experience, right? We are, I think, quite conscientious with what we say, and we've done a lot of work. And I don't claim that I cannot be wrong, or I may not have overturned that keystone that would prove that my whole thesis is wrong. I'm not claiming that's the case, but I think that we've done for, many, many years of looking into this, we can pretty much say that money's misrepresented. And so when we claim there's a misrepresentation, and it's a misrepresentation that is ubiquitous, and that we also prove with being able to use empirical events to back us up in theory, we can prove that misrepresentation is what leads to widespread systemic malaise. So if I say to someone, you're just somebody talking, little people, not big, rich billionaires, right? And I say, you are participating in a misrepresentation, and they have a reckless disregard for determining whether I'm right or not.
Right.
Then they're no longer, it's not just innocent or negligent, they're just bang, they go straight up into the category of reckless disregard.
So they become complicit to the situation that now they've been made privy to. Is that what you're saying? They're complicit.
Yeah, I mean, they can say, look, hold, as long as they say, look, I'm studying this. I don't say you're right or wrong, but I'm not convinced, and I'm going to look into it, and I'm going to make the effort that you did, because people have to understand that the effort that went into the work we've done in the MSTA is all pro bono.
I would love for you to take the opportunity for our audience to share with us at least your BIBO website, to walk us through a background of an understanding of who it is that's talking, because there are several people that haven't seen our previous sessions. And also, and also I invited my good friend John Burke. He had also put some comments in the section last week, so I invited him to come in if he has time. But please take a few moments at least and walk us through what BIBO currency is, to give us a background.
Okay, sure. I mean, BIBO currency was something. Let me just share the screen here.
Yeah, we have a visual audience, so we can always come back to the back and forth, but let's give context to what we're talking about.
Okay, I'll just say it. I'll just explain it. So BIBO currency simply was a project that arose when I made the contact with Dr. Sergio Dominguez at the University Polytechnic of Madrid, when we were both working on European projects, IT projects, and also, well, I wasn't, no, it was mostly Spanish publicly funded projects for IT. So we got together, and it was during the crises, 2008, collapse, and we, I sort of brought up, because he's a control systems engineer, professor of control systems engineering, and I basically brought up the problem of him analyzing his mortgage in terms of his analytical skills that come along with control systems engineering, and out of that discussion, I learned a lot about basic principles of control systems engineering, et cetera, and fundamentals and terms. And so we wrote a paper together, and that's when I discovered the acronym bounded input, bounded output. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but Mark, hold on just a moment, please.
Okay.
Understand, the audience that I have, this is being streamed to our AHIABGA network. The audience that I have, for many of them, English is not their first language. And so for many of them, seeing us talk is one thing, but actually having visuals also helps them. So I put this in.
Yeah.
So I put this into the chat, so those that are able can actually access it. But if I will, and unless you can, at least take a moment just to review what's on this one page. It won't take long, maybe less than 2 minutes. So
sure. So this is just the welcome page, and basically what we do is we establish the fundamental tenets.
Let me just read it, and then I'll be through. Yeah.
Okay.
So welcome to Passive BIBO Currency in support of the MSTA. BIBO is an acronym referring to bounded input, bounded output. The sine qua non requirement for stability in the types of systems that include any money system. Passivity refers to a particular case of BIBO where output never exceeds input, or in the case of currency, debt is always less or equal to prices. That is, money is not a negotiable object, as explained in a document that they can access when they go to the website. BIBO precisely defines stability in control systems engineering. Understanding BIBO as applied to money systems is crucial, as it provides a powerful basis for clarifying current money paradigm issues and the criteria for unit stability, as summarized by the following theorem. The stable currency unit theorem. A passive BIBO stable money system, by definition, implies that all of the system's components, transactions, are also necessarily passive BIBO stable. Therefore, it directly follows that If every transaction is passive, BMO stable, and all money created is necessarily a product of such stable transactions, then all such units will necessarily remain a bounded
Maintain.
ratio. Pardon?
Will necessarily maintain.
Or yes, will necessarily maintain a bounded ratio with all system inputs to those transactions, and therefore the units will also be stable by definition. So this, I assume, is referenced by Marc Gauvin and Sergio Dominguez back in 2011.
Yeah.
So the significance of the above cannot be emphasized enough, as the math of stability categorically dictates that for the unit to be stable, it matters not who performs the transaction that generates currency. It matters not when the transactions are performed. It matters not what wealth is transacted. It matters not why we transact wealth. It matters not how many units are generated. All that matters for unit stability is that the transactions that generate the units are passive BMO transactions. Absolutely nothing else matters. Put another way, intervention begets instability because in its absence, passive stability is the default. In layman terms, this means that the stability of money is not determined by controlling the creation, quantity, or so-called flow of money, but rather by the nature and definition of transactions. If all transactions are passive BMO stable, then the currency created through said transactions will also be stable. Thus, suppression of people's commercial autonomy and freedom is not required in order to maintain a stable and trustworthy currency. So thank you, Marc, for allowing me
very powerful stuff.
Yes, it is. But that's why it's important that every word be explained so that the people that we're talking to have a better understanding.
Okay, I misunderstood your question. I thought you were asking me to give sort of the background of how I got into this, but yes, yeah, but good. I'm glad you did that. That's
Well,
excellent. That's excellent.
We have a surprise guest. Mr. Dan Taylor has joined us. Dan, could you unmute and introduce yourself, please? And we'd like to see a visual if possible. Hi there.
Yeah.
How you doing, Dan?
Doing well. Yeah. So Marc and I crossed paths and caught up. Spent a lot of time. He was very patient with me. My sort of I don't know how to describe it, but fundamentalist approach to understanding things drives most people nuts. And Marc very sort of generously spent more than an afternoon with me, helping me understand. I can't say that I grasped all of the the nuances and so forth, but definitely benefited from the conversation, and really just started to think about the sort of practical applications of where Marc's ideas could come into play. And they've had a sort of a transformational effect on me in terms of the way that I'm thinking about the economics of biodiversity, but really of ecology and ecosystems, and that they may be entirely divorced of money, at least in the way that we think of it now, and that perhaps sort of the currency of life is life itself and health thereof, quality and so forth. And so these ideas and thought processes for a banker are all very bizarre, and they were provoked by Marc's work. So I'm grateful for that. And I had the opportunity, Marc, to meet Andrew just what was it, yesterday, I think, or just this week.
Excellent.
I thank you for including me on these calls, and don't mean to interrupt. I just freed up from something else and thought I'd jump on.
This is excellent for me because it makes it much easier for me to talk about this. I want to hone in on one thing that's very important, because one of the problems that I have in communicating with these ideas with people is the fact that I have what some people call a professional deformation, right? And from the point of view of actually solving real problems, I'm not a star engineer by any means or anything like that, but I've had the opportunity to work closely with some of the top IT people in the world, And I do have a background in science that allows me to follow. And also, to some degree, I've learned how to use in what people might call imaginative or creative way. But essentially, the idea that's very hard for people to understand when you're solving real problems is to differentiate between a wish list, right? These are the things we would like, and the discipline of solving the problems that allow you to get to satisfy that wish list in the best way possible, right? So a wish list is something that is just something we would like, and we think that we would like, but it's often when we get to the nitty-gritty of what we have to do to get that wish list, we say, well, I don't know if it's worth that. And that's when we start being more realistic. But when we've defined a problem very clearly, then, and we've all voted that we want to solve that problem, right? We don't want more financial crises. We don't want to go through this roller coaster that we're experiencing. It's just not good. It hurts everyone on all levels. So we pretty know that there's a problem. We can define it. Then we have the requirements. And the beauty about doing something where the objective framework isn't political discussion or debate, we've solved the problem logically. And we've all decided we want to solve this problem. And it turns out that if the problem's real, then why would anybody not want to solve it? I mean, how does anybody want to live in a world that doesn't work? So, which is this whole conspiracy idea that bankers are conspiring against it because they're just little devils and they like to see people is wrong. It's just they don't have a hold of this massive system that they're running. And maybe they're guilty of excusing themselves and covering up and trying to get rid of the responsibility. Well, we all do that to some or other degree. But the fundamental issue is that if somebody would say, hey, we don't have to go through another crisis like 2008, where suicide rates under bankers, apparently, from what I could gather, went through the roof. Obviously, we don't have to do that. And there's no real palpable cost, because any potential loss in the future is compensated by the benefits of having eliminated this problem that affects everyone, rich or poor. So the question is, what are the requirements of the requirements? And if we can grasp the relationship between the requirements that we define through a well expressed problem statement, right? And that's logically consistent, a sensible problem statement. We said this is a problem, and these are requirements to solve that problem, right? Then we don't have to worry about anything else, because we've already decided we're going to solve the problem. And following through with the requirement, if it turns out that the requirement, if it turns out that the requirement is more costly than the problem, then we had a problem defining the problem statement. Right? We didn't do it properly, right? And so the thing is that we're trying to solve all these problems that have, to some minimum degree, and sometimes to an extraordinary degree compared to people's common knowledge, we're trying to solve problems with people who don't have a systemic approach to solving complex problems, right? And this is why this thing is so anomalous, because we've been dealing with money for millennia, and I mean this misrepresentation didn't just happen when when the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913. This problem goes back millennia, and this millennial problem of money, has always been with us. And the question fundamental is the misrepresentation? Is it there? Is it not? And everyone has a responsibility. If I say it's there, and I'm not an idiot, for everyone to say, well, is that true or false? Because if I say, you're nobody, why should I listen to you? Then I'm possibly demonstrating, even if I turn out to be right, I'm still demonstrating a kind of reckless disregard, because someone, for some reason, has said, hey, this is wrong.
Well, let me ask you a question now.
Sure.
As I understand it, next year is going to be the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods meeting. And that was actually the foundation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah.
Is now a good time to start having that conversation, Mark?
Well, I think which conversation exactly?
Well, the conversation about if we're going to fix the problem, it seems like we're going to have to start by recognizing that the people that are perpetrating the problem, they're aware of the problem too, aren't they? Or is this something that?
Yeah, no, I would say it's actually, so if I may, and
Please,
I
yes.
mean,
Please do.
yeah. So like, I tend to agree with the way that that Mark has premised it, only because like I've been, I wouldn't, there's probably, further and further layers that one could pursue, but I've been pretty close to the belly of the beast, right? Like, I mean, we printed the money in Hong Kong and so forth. We were the de facto central bank for, if not Asia, then China, right? So, so I'm, sort of not the expert on all things, and banking is a man-made construct, as is the current expression of the financial. But what I can say, but just on a personal level, is there's no bad people that are perpetrating. There are bad actors within the system. There is because you are the authority on banking as a banker, and because the system operates in many cases as a sort of a supranational of itself. It operates outside of the scope of regulation, just because the regulations aren't sophisticated or in tune enough to really get in there. There's much less of a sort of a criminal sort of, there's no criminal contingent that dominate the banking sector. So I wouldn't characterize it as folks who are perpetrating, but only because I think that what that does is it limits our, and I'm not taking issue with you, Andrew. I love you. I'm not saying, I'm just trying, because we had the opportunity to meet, I'm trying to express honestly to you that I think that, like, when we hear these various politicians get up there and bang on about the bankers, what they're actually doing is preventing us from understanding the true nature of the problem and addressing it. So I don't think that they are aware of the problem, because when you're a banker and you're authority on banking, your context is the banking system, and you sort of fail to see the broader system or organism, depending on how you think about it.
That's really what I needed, because this morning there was actually an article. Now, quote, venture capital funds are finally, quote, getting it, and so they're intending to make a commitment to reach net zero, right, through the venture capital funds that they put into effect. On the flip side of this, organizations like the United Nations Global Compact, they have what's called the CFO Task Force. This is a combination of 74 organizations representing over $1.3 trillion that are saying this is something that we need to do to focus our attention on what needs to happen. But Mark, if what you're saying is true, it's we, the individuals, that have to stand up and say that this is not the way we need to keep going. Or what's our responsibility here, Mark?
Well, I think we're jumping the gun, because the focus that I had for today, and I'll just maybe wrap it up quickly and then we can continue. But the focus I had for today was to simply say, the first thing we've all understood, the first step, that pretty much everyone's innocent, and even experts are innocent, because I mean, for example, in economics, you ask an economist what stability is, right? And he'll give you an answer that has nothing to do with formal stability. In other words, it's an intuitive approach to a much more complex problem that they haven't really taken into consideration. And if you remember our last meeting, where we did that table, right? And we were talking about the 4 types of transactions. Well, it's like basic stuff when you do science and engineering, is you always look at all of the permutations, because you're always discovering things that you think, because your bias or subjective view will make you only look at the things that seem the most important to you now, but you'll discover little treasures in looking at the other permutations. So in economics, right, as we know it and as it's manifest in our lives, right, we're only concerned with negative and positive accounts and within a sort of an antagonistic kind of view, as opposed to realizing that the real fear or the real risk multiplication doesn't reside in most of the transactions that the people with no money undertake. And it's where the people who have more than they need are actually doing commerce with the people who don't. And so, I mean, so we try to put that into perspective. So what I think the important thing here is to understand that we have a common problem, and no one's looking at, you could think of it like people sort of say, well, how is it that, like, what have you studied? What doctorates do you have? And I say, no, I can't. I have the basic knowledge I need to understand what I'm saying. That's for sure. But I kind of stubbed my toe on this, in the sense that there's a discipline in studying data in computer science. And one of the things you do when you study data, you define data, is that in object-oriented programming, more specifically, is that you say, okay, I have to create my classes in a consistent way. So I'll have my parent class, and I'll create all of the different instances of that class and subclasses. And then there's certain rules about that discovered, which is called a multiple inheritance. In other words, if you start defining something in terms of several different parent classes, right? You have to have a really, really good reason to do that. But normally what you do is that you create a completely new class, right? That has nothing to do with any other existing class. Or you say, well, I break up my problem and I'm going to express that same idea, but using the classes independently. So the question is that we have measure, we have object of trade, which is, call it value, call it, different terms sort of kind of colloquially are used, in prose, like they'll say unit of account, which is basically measure. If it's a unit, it's a measure. And then you say, well, okay, then I have a store of value, which means, okay, so you have this thing which actually contains value. And then you'll say a medium of exchange, and you say, okay, so why don't we look at those two things separately? Why do we have to dump them together? Now, where's the requirement to lump them together? And the requirement, lo and behold, where does it come from? We've always done it that way, right? And it goes back millennia. So I stub my foot and I say, like an autistic moron, I come along and I say, hey, this is multiple inheritance, and that's a no-no in my object-oriented programming thing. And everybody says, where the fuck are you coming from? But that's true. And there's a logic for it.
It's not only true, it's also, I think, a healthy exercise to conduct with some regularity, no matter what sort of field you operate in, right? Like to revisit assumptions. And I think that's, I sort of have my reservation. Like, I think if I may just, I've said this before to Mark, but Andrew, I don't know if I mentioned it or on an email that you were.
I'm with it.
Yeah, but basically,
we have a new Dan, we have a new audience. So take a moment, introduce yourself, and then go ahead.
Mark already knows who I am.
But we're okay, but we're reaching more than just Mark. It's not just us here.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Just a moment, please.
Yeah,
and then go ahead. You can make something up.
No, don't do that.
Well, tell us who you are, and then let's go proceed from there. We have an audience, and we're trying to educate them about the importance of this conversation. So I want to let them know who's talking, Dan.
Okay, yeah. So I come from a sort of a modest background, if you will. More focused on sort of nature and humanistic enterprise. But of course, I decided to rebel against my sort of formation, and then I pursued a route, in finance and on Wall Street, and had the opportunity to meet a number of wonderful people, numerous really fantastic people, spend a little bit of time abroad, running one of the pieces of the businesses for one of the sort of international banks that most of us are familiar with, and then through the course of human events, as it were, I wound up back here in upstate New York, where it all started for me, and so this sort of return to start in a way journey has just provided me with the benefit, by the grace of what have you, to relook at things, and so what I try to do is to maintain a balanced perspective on the experiences I had as an adult, but focus most of my efforts on how they might be applicable to more immediate requirements around Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food and shelter, and so forth. So that's my interest here, and yeah, I mean, I happy to sort of answer any questions, but that's generally where I'm coming from. What I wanted to mention, though, as a sort of a there's sort of this bankers aren't bad part, and then there's sort of, sort of inherently evil part, because this debilitates our ability to actually sort of observe the circumstances for what they are. I don't mind people are upset. I do think that
it makes the discussion belligerent when it
right,
doesn't
it
need
makes
to be.
it belligerent, and it is, although as Mark did, I will recognize these sort of disparities in, like contribution to effort and the lack of self-reflection and so forth, that we should all hold the expectation, we should all hold bankers to the expectation that they do these things and consider these things. So without getting any more into that dynamic, the other thing that I think is important, and it's equally sort of controversial in some ways, and difficult to synthesize, but the fact of the matter is that for history and reasons that I'm not the authority on by any measure, there was a decision, at least by the Western world, at least by the people who were invited into the room, that the US dollar would represent the global reserve currency, and that this was for the benefit of freedom and democracy globally, and that it's not that we can't sort of contemplate the problems with the imperfect system and how it may need to be adjusted, and that mandate may need to be revisited. I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not here to revisit that mandate, because it's not fair for me to do that as an individual. This was a more or less global decision on the back of decades of history. So I just want to basically, with all that said, and not getting into any more of the difficulties associated with that, I just think we have to really recognize that at the core, the essence of the formation documents for this republic here in the United States speaks to a universal and perhaps, if you will, sacred truth for our, and so that, that there is good that's done with that system, and that we don't want to give the impression that we're challenging that. And the good that's there, just that we're trying to bring sort of more effort and conscious thought to the current manifestation and applicability of it.
Agreed. And I think that what Mark is bringing to the table is very important, because it's up to us to have the responsibility to do that recognize that responsibility. So yes,
yeah,
yes,
and
yes.
I think I can have let me know, Dan, if this helps you in terms of treating that issue. Because of money's misrepresentation, we've had a constant struggle of failed civilizations developing systems that ultimately resort to some kind of excess. So if you think of it as a system being inherently, in systems terms, as being inherently unstable, that means anybody who deals in that, no matter what their intentions are, or what their hopes are, or what their objectives are in the pure sense, there's going to be all sorts of excesses and harm coming about that have nothing to do with what people are trying to do, and a lot to do with just the systemics that people are not really aware or don't think are that important, or just don't know how to evaluate in its full scope and dimensions. So from a systems point of view, we do have a way of seeing how instability just leads to waste, discontent, and ultimately, in terms of managing our needs, our common needs in society, belligerence, and etc. So that's sort of our historical background, right? So out of that has come pretty much in the 19th and 20th century, came up, this idea of this capitalism versus communism type idea, right? So we have those who have a lot of stuff, the rich, right? They got to be the sons of bitches because they got it made, right? And then there's the people who do not have, and that somehow there is a relationship of abuse, systemic and almost, conspiratorial abuse between the two, without taking notice that a lot of the tension between those two is a product of the system that both of them are, inadvertently unwittingly embracing. In other words, it's taken for a given that money is an object of trade and has to circulate, And so if you're going to do it in the name of the people, then it's the government who's going to control the circulation, right? And it's going to determine where money goes and how it goes. And then if the government's not going to do that, then it's going to be the people who have the greatest stakeholders, which are the ones who have created more wealth and created a society of, and have been able to create wealth. And so they suddenly now pretty much run the show because they apparently have most at stake, right? So this is sort of the way of looking at it. The problem is that just the simple proposition of combining measure and some circulating object, right? And trying to control that circulation or manipulating the access to that unit by other people in itself creates instability that affects the whole system. So it basically makes things worse, not better. So the proposal that we have is to say, let's continue with the idea. Okay, so out of that fight, there are two interesting things that come out of that. And that is, you have the far right that talks about the rights of the individual and freedom and not to be, interfered with, and autonomy. And then on the left, you have this thing of everyone has a right to eat, everybody has a right to have a home, etc. Rights, personal rights. And that is what I think you're talking about, Daniel. I think that this tradition of defending the rights of the individual as an autonomous member of a collective, a truly autonomous member of the collective, cannot be lost. And that has been exploited by both sides of this belligerent contention, right? To say we do it better than the other. But the real issue is that we can't lose that, because the consequences of not dealing with this problem as it should be dealt with is that we're going to end up with winner takes all and basically rationing everything to the vast majority of people. And that's something we cannot allow to happen if we love our children. So I don't know if that was helpful.
But no, I mean, it isn't, to the extent that I think it helps me, if I may just respond. So I wouldn't say, I'm not talking about that, actually. What I'm talking about is sort of where you then, I think, got closer to, which is what I'm talking to use Thomas Jefferson's words, is before, he actually, in a rough draft of the Declaration of the Independence, he called it the sacred and profound, right? Sacred and profound. I'll call it the sacred and profound truth of independent and equal station. So you can talk about that in a metaphysical sense. You can talk about that in an ethical sense. You can talk about that in relation to this like you called autonomous, sort of right of the individual and so forth. All I'm talking about is providing for mechanisms where we have the best chance of one individual's freedom to exist and not be usurped or compromised by someone else's. So whether that's talking about just what people have a right to in terms of food and shelter and all that stuff, I'm not even going as far and the political spectrum is something that I've grown increasingly disenchanted with, sort of altogether. And so it's not to come to you here with these comments in a way that suggests that I do or don't agree with you personally on any number of things you're saying, because we invariably would probably disagree on certain things, but naturally have actually a lot of overlap. And that's why we enjoy these conversations as we do. But from a professional perspective, it's not my place to interject those into conversations like this, where the implications of any type of amended approach should not be sort of biased. At least in my view, in this case, if we were to talk about something that has such broad and far-reaching implications for others, then we should almost be willing to surrender the powers of the earth that nature's got and the laws of nature entitled one of them, which is the equal station. So you and I, if we're looking to sort of have a conversation here that have broader implications for a whole, and other people are participating in that conversation and they're going to listen to us, they should understand, or we should provide, or we should be committed, not understand or say, we should be committed to subordinating our own sort of selves and our own desires, wants, and personal views on things, and that we should be motivated for the protection of independent and equal station for others, and at the price of perhaps our own, because we will have to sacrifice our own views. We can talk about them at the bar over a beer, but in the context of a solution, you know, they don't have a place really. And so I think for me, where I've gotten to is less along, not so much about that if we don't do it, then this terrible thing happens, and that we need to do it, and if we do it, everything will be fine. So I'm not really there yet. Where I am is that in order for us to have like an intelligent conversation about the impact of the, let's just say, the velocity of money. People like to talk about the velocity of money. You know, it's sort of a antiquated concept at this point because of the various mechanisms that influence it, but velocity is indeed a vector, and in order to calculate a vector, you need a magnitude and a direction. And because we don't even have any way of you know, identifying a proximity of those two very important components, we're at a loss as to whether or not the system is right or wrong, and that's a mistake, right? That is a mistake. Yeah.
Let me, but the point of this meeting, I didn't know you were going to come along, and I'm glad you're here, really. But the point is I think one of the ways we can start to understand each other is that if we don't understand the language, and you just gave a good example, right? I remember years and years ago, I made that very same argument that, you know, when they say about the velocity of money, that's a misuse. What they want to do is they wanted to say the speed of money, perhaps. But if you use the velocity, that's a little disingenuous, because it gives people the idea, you know, anyway, and that whole theory of the quantitative theory of money has also been put into question and highly debated, and this new thing of quantitative easing, you know, just putting slews and slews of new money, not resulting in inflation. So the whole thing was it's not very helpful. But I think the whole basis of economic science needs a serious overhaul, because a lot of the things that really matter to us we can measure without having to use dollars, and we can know, oh yeah, so what are you telling me, that because I have this funny money in my account, my kids aren't going to eat this wheat they need that's being thrown off of ships to control prices? I don't understand. So we need to get to sort of brass tacks. But I think one of the fundamental things is that we're all locked into these agreements, and they're you know, verbal and written agreements. They're all contracts in one way or another, and can be discussed by law. And we all have these agreements, and we're making agreements with money every day. And therefore, if money, or a concept of money, is wrong, because whether we acquired it innocently or negligently or fraudulently, it's wrong, and it has to be discussed and has to be clarified. So the proposal we're making is not that everything's going to be great and dandy if we fix it. We're going to say we're going to just stop. We're going to prevent a problem that's running away with itself. Now, what does that mean? You know, from a social political standpoint, it just means that we don't have to deal with this problem that's really created by our own solution, right? And so that doesn't prevent us as a country of identifying ourselves with our other values. It doesn't prevent us from us standing and speaking in the international community about what we think should happen here and there. What it does, though, is it prevents a lot of things happening that nobody understands why they're happening or how they could have happened. And that is, it really elevates the bar of for accountability, right? And that is that, you know, we didn't do this because we needed money. We did this because the town needs a bridge. That's why we did it. But if suddenly, you know, in Spain, we have this incredible phenomena that's just amazing, and that is during the prior to the crisis, airports were built that have never serviced the plane to this day. And the only motive that they were built was because somebody swindled, got the deal going, and it created jobs, which was good for the politicians, and it just attracted money. Everybody is doing nonsense and nonsensical things because of this imperative to get money. So that's what we want to discuss. And the problem is that we have to, as you're suggesting, and that I've suggested also, which I said we should collaborate on this, Dan, and that is we should have to present this issue to people in a non-belligerent way, because no one wins. No one wins. And I always give the example of, the big, there are people who are billionaires because they built really good, neat things, and they're really valuable. Maybe in a kind of distorted context of society that may have a bearing, but fundamentally what they did was honest and good work, and it resulted in something that people enjoy and want. So if somebody makes a fortune, if that's their motive, and in the process they do well and they have a nice living and they get to play with the project of their life, that's great. There's no reason. So, are we harming them? No. We're simply saying, if people really want what you've done, which might be the case, then we're just going to make it easier. We're going to make a lot of things easier because, and this is the key, is you as a financial expert should appreciate, and this is the argument that we presented, I think briefly in the previous discussion, and that is we can eliminate at least 2/3 of risk, actuarial risk that society is bearing. And it's not just the poor that bear that, but it's everyone in one way or another, So why do we have this risk? What's the trade-off, right? And there's a very interesting argument. It's very technical, but it's something that I find I'm trying to remember that it's by an engineer, Stein, who talks about the cost of instability. In other words, nature, when we do things like really fast airplanes, right, the supersonic airplanes, we're playing with stability. And the cost of the instability is just absorbed by nature, by us building planes that we're going to use just a few times or whatever, and then throwing them away or recycling them, right? So there's if you think of a thermodynamic cost to instability. And what you're trying to do is that you're bearing the cost, the overhead of instability to get a kind of immediate performance, right? So the question is when it comes to economics and money, if we have this instability that we're trying to use to hone in and get control over the economy, whatever, right? We have this overhead cost, and what we're pointing out is that, sure, if we want to make those kinds of decisions, we can still make them. But what we can't do is allow for that overhead to become what destroys our unit of measure. So if money is the reference of measure, we cannot tolerate, it's an abstract thing, we cannot tolerate that it itself be what absorbs this overhead. And so we have to clear that. And what's the benefit of this? The benefit is that we're all going to live, we're all going to be able to breathe more deeply, and we're all going to be able to just relax a little bit, look at all that's going on right now, and say, doesn't have to be this. We can think it all out. And if we have to balance trade between two regions, we can do it over any extent. Once we have a stable unit, we can plan for any period of time to do it. We don't have to apply austerity, right? So I think that we need to come together, and we need to realize that we have real solutions to immediate problems, and that although they seem kind of, that's so fundamental, that little dinky, what money definition of money, why is that important? Then, well, it can be very important if you have a feeling and understanding of how errors propagate through a system, and even compound to create a kind of instability that no one knows where it came from. But it could be this little thing here. Like if you think about instability as a prick in some kind of balloon, right? That little prick might seem small, but that's eventually going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to collapse the balloon.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and then our ability to sort of recognize that and address it is limited based on the the sort of where we are today, for, to simplify it. And I have this, I won't even call it a formulated hypothesis, and certainly not a tested one, but I have this idea, let's say, that that Adam Smith's invisible hand is sort of tied behind his back, that this sort of equilibrium of prices and allocation of capital and resources in such a way that benefits the society has been compromised by some of the conditions that you described. So I think we do need to look at it for sure. And I can't stress enough how much I appreciate you bringing this perspective to the table. And I think it's a very important and productive exercise to conduct.
I like to kick one thing into here. I'm not so much as beg to differ with you, Mark, but I do want to believe that there are models that are being created, particularly by the reinsurance agencies or the reinsurance market, to deal with risk. You might remember or not, right? About 8 years ago, there was something called the African Risk Capacity Agency that was set up in Bermuda. That was funded originally by Europe, the United States, et cetera. Now it's funded by the Africans themselves. The idea was to project the potential losses, damages that could occur with catastrophic climate change, and also the effects of naturally occurring events, droughts, et cetera, so on and so forth. But they are actually able to create these models that do determine a specific risk analysis. So I'm wondering, Mark, is it possible we can look at creating models to address these issues?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are two aspects to actuarial science. One is I'm going to measure the probability of two cars colliding, and that's or the probability of buildings collapsing, or whatever kinds of series of natural physical events that are, in principle, determined by what we know about science, right? And what we know about the physical world, right? So that's what we call the real world risk, right? But then there's the other aspect in which traditionally the insurance industry has always failed to grasp, and that is the impact of financial risk.
Okay.
And the financial aspect. So when it's one thing if I say to you, okay, you want to build an iron ore mine here, and you want to build your offices here, and you want to do this, right? And I can analyze that whole prospect, knowing what we know about geology, knowing about how much ore there is, and how many people you need, and what building, and I can figure that I can tell you that there's a certain amount of risk, and I can also say that given the means or the proceeds by which we mine iron ore today, and all that, there's going to be all sorts of environmental effects, and I can make all of those calculations very well. And I can also factor in the possibility of a force majeure, as we say in contracts, right?
Yeah.
Which is natural disaster, et cetera.
Right.
And I can say, and I can work it out. And so, but then I have the problem of saying, okay, what's the financial? How do I translate that to the financial world? And that's where our work can be incredibly beneficial in terms of doing the actuarial work properly and having and being able to make that activity sustainable, right? Mm-hmm. Because ultimately people will end up, creating either in contract promising things that they're never going to really deliver when you read the fine line, right? So that they're really saying they're covering it all, but they really aren't, because, like I like to say, the devil has an impeccable word, right? The only problem is that when he delivers, or it delivers, I like saying not he or she, but it delivers, things never appear like you thought they were going to be like, when you sign the deal, right? So that's a little bit like, so we can make that much more transparent, and also have a very clear understanding of the relationship between what's the real risk and what's that financial risk. So we can pretty much eliminate financial risk, right? In other words, financial risk is like nonsensical. It's like saying, if I don't make this chair and do it properly, I'm not going to have inches to work with in the future, so I have that risk of not being able to do another chair because I won't have any inches, right? That we can pretty much eliminate that. And the purpose or the interest of money, or the objective of money, would become for people to measure relative value of things so that they can freely determine what they want and what they don't want, and why, each in their own circumstances, etc. Right? And that's an interesting proposition to get information, but it's never going to make or break us as a society. Right? We should never be. We should never feel that our financial collapse will collapse our actual physical existence, which is what's happening now. So in that sense, we're limiting that risk. Now, the question is it if you take the Bain report of 2012, they make this very clear distinction between what's called financial assets, purely financial assets, and financial assets corresponding to the real economy, right? So the real economy is basically anything that takes real resources to do, or are the actual business of the real resources. So, so teaching and intellectual property also, because it takes real resources to develop. So all that stuff that we trade as real goods and services represents the real economy, right? And so they had estimated that the total world assets then in 2012 was, and it projected to be around 900 trillion now, but it was then 600 trillion. That's 2012. So 10 years later, it's probably around 900 trillion. And the interesting thing was that 2/3 of those assets correspond to the purely financial, right? So that means, now everyone knows, wink, wink, wink. The 3/3 of financial assets are focused on being resolved in the real world, in the real assets, right? So basically, we play this game of 3/3 risk, of which we resolve in the same domain where only 1/3 of the risk is created, which is the real economy. So when we're playing that game, right, then you ask yourself, okay, maybe we don't need those 2/3 financial risk coming to bear and added to. So I like to say that we can reduce overall actuarial risk if we put the financial risk with the real world risk. We can reduce it by at least 2/3, at least, because the very fact that 1/3 is bearing the full weight of the 3/3, right, will augment its 1/3 risk, right? So we're probably going to reduce risk enormously. So the question is that, do we really need this risk? Because the only real reason that we have this risk is from, I think, a mistaken vision that somehow we need to be able to punish each other. I mean, it's sort of like that. It's sort of like, the good guys win and the bad guys are losers, and it's turning out that it's not true. I mean, I always, as a musician, I always think, well, Mozart wasn't a loser, but he certainly was a loser economically and died very young and buried in an anonymous grave. So, so the real issues, and then when I was working in IT, developing standards, and I did my research, and I realized that the amount of talent around is, just talking about the content industry, which is music and stuff like that, the standard stuff, right? And I was representing the Author Society of Spain. But when you think of that, you say to yourself, my God, the industry has never, ever represented more than a tiny fraction of all this extraordinary talent that's out there, doing, and we can have access to that talent. And then I realized that the internet meant that we're no longer in a situation where we need to take all the people to the stadium to see the guru, but we are allowing everyone to find that in their own neighborhood, there are a whole bunch of gurus there too. And all we need is the means by which we can support each other, so that we can, we can have a, we don't need a star What we need is to recognize the stars that are around us that are probably locked in little closets or tiny little apartments trying to do something that has nothing to do with their nature and not exploiting their ability. And they're doing it because they're just giving up their lives for their loved ones, you know? So we got to stop this nonsense.
This seems to be a way that we can begin to have a conversation about ways to stop this nonsense. So next week, we'll come back and we'll take another journey down this road, Mark. But Dan,
Okay.
what are your thoughts? We're going to wrap it up, but what are your thoughts?
Oh no,
about
just I agree that the sort of what is it, social mobility, for lack of a more profound way to describe it, that is lacking in today's society. Is definitely something that leaves us void of the beautiful potential that every integrant to the whole has to offer, and that we do have to find ways to release that potential to solve many of the sort of crises that we are facing, arbitrarily, artificially or not. Self-made or not. That I can't agree with that more, Mark, that there is some structural impediments to just allowing people to bring their gifts to the table, and that's a tragedy, it's a travesty, and it's something that we can work on for sure.
As a simple afternote or whatever, it's the philosophy of let every candle shine, no matter how small, right? Or apparently small. Right?
Well,
and big fires can be started with tiny little flames.
Small spark. Well,
okay,
on that
God
note,
bless, and thank you very much for being here, Dan.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
And I hope we do this together more often, and we talk in the interim too.
Yes, sir, definitely, and I do as
okay.
well.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this, and this has been good because I wasn't doing all the talking all the time.
well, look, guys, this is our spark, right?
Yeah.
Only 5 corporations own 95% of the world's media. It's up to us to have these conversations, to create our own narrative, to attract our audience, to then grow that. So I love both of you, and I really appreciate your being here. And we'll be here every Wednesday until something else changes. We'll be here.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.